Hello again. Now, here we are on English Language A-Level with another lesson. This is about verbs. This is the second lesson that we're doing about verbs. This is number 2. The first lesson that we did about verbs, we looked at the different categories of verbs like mental and verbal and material and all those. And we looked at the difference between main and auxiliary verbs. And we focused in on primary auxiliary verbs and also modal verbs as well. So in this lesson, we're going to look at things like verb aspect, verb number, and also mood as well. Okay, so we're going to start by just thinking about person, right? So here in English, here's a nice table here that just illustrates one grammatical feature of English verbs. So this is the verb to play. And if we were to conjugate this verb to play in the present tense, it would go I play, you play, he, she, or it plays, we play, you play, they play. So we've got the singular forms here and we've got the plural forms over there. The only thing I'm showing that to you for is because we've got this little S inflection on the end of the verb here. Now, when you see an S on the end of a word, automatically you might think, oh, it must be a plural. Not so. Not with this one. It's not a plural at all, is it? It's actually a third person present simple form. So in standard English, we happen to put an S inflection on the end of a third person present simple form, and that makes it standard. If we were not to do it, then that wouldn't really impact on meaning, you know. So you would understand the sentence, she play tennis, just as much as you would say she plays tennis. So it just happens to be one of those conventions of standard British English. Okay, so that's to do with verb person. We now move on to tense. So, I mean, the present tense obviously is the base form of the verb. So I write, for example, or they dance, that's the base form of the verb. For the past tense, if it's a regular verb, i.e. a so-called strong verb, then what you're doing is you're putting ed on the end. So that's another inflection on the ending. Unfortunately, English being English, we have lots of irregularities. These are so-called strong verbs. They are strong verbs because they dare to be different. I am a strong verb. I dare to be irregular. Like drink, for example, becomes I drank rather than I drinked. And that's going to be important when we come on to CLD, Children's Language Development, and we have children at 2 years old saying things like, Mummy, I dwinked my milk, like that. So what they're doing is they're doing what a researcher called Chomsky would call a virtuous error. So it's perfectly rational for them to come up with a past tense form like drinked. And yet it's a form that a child won't have heard an adult articulate. And so therefore, our friend Chomsky would say, this is evidence of a language acquisition device. Okay, they're like little white-coated scientists. In comes the data into their brains. They're hearing these massive words and they're sort of formulating their own rules and then using language in creative ways. Okay, so drinked and I drank, that's really interesting. And, you know, there are quite a huge number of verbs which are strong, i.e. they have irregular past tense forms. Perhaps the most irregular form is the verb to be, highly irregular. Look at it. I mean, in the present form, you've got I am, you are, he or she, or it is, and then we are, you are, and they are. So the form of the verb to be changes with the person that it is. And I think it's similar in other languages as well. You know, if you look at French, for example, je suis, tu es, il, elle est, nous sommes, you know, it changes with the different form that it is. Okay, so we've got various irregularities with various verbs. Let's talk about voice and aspect. So voice is whether a verb is in the active voice or the passive voice. And we're going to do a bit more work on that a bit later, but just compare these two sentences. Manchester City won, unfortunately, the Premiership. So that's active voice. So we can see at the beginning of the sentence who did the winning. In this case, it was Man City. and there we've got the verb won, and we've got an object over here. So the subject of the verb is being foregrounded at the beginning of the sentence. And that's slightly different in tone. It's the same meaning, I suppose, but it's slightly different in tone with this sentence here, which is the passive voice. So the Premiership was won by Manchester City. So what's happened here is that the subject has now been taken from the beginning of the word, and it's been sort of put at the back there, and what was the object has been foregrounded at the front. Okay, so what it's doing is it's putting the focus on the Premiership. That's like the key thing that you're made to think about in that sentence. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the uses of the active and the passive voice a bit later on. Let's move on to the other one, aspect. So verb aspects in English can either be simple or progressive. Now, if it's a simple aspect verb, it means that it doesn't have an ing on the end. So it's a finite kind of action that has happened at one time. So the Conservatives won the election. So that's the simple aspect. If I was to say the Conservatives are negotiating Brexit, there what I'm doing is I'm putting an ing on the end there, and that shows that it's a continuous thing. You know, they've been negotiating Brexit for the last 258 years. They're doing it now, and they're still going to be doing it in 2079. Okay, so ing on the end means it's a progressive continuous verb. Okay, now then, let's think a bit more about the old active and passive thing. So I'm going to show you two newspaper headlines. Bizarrely, here is a picture of a fox, and so here are the headlines that go with it. Beast seriously injures baby. Baby is mauled by fox. So pause the video for a second there and think, what are the similarities and differences between the two, and how is language being used? Okay, I'm assuming that you've done that task. Now, let's look at the first one here. Beast seriously injures baby. What I'm thinking here is it active or is it passive voice? And the answer is that it's active. It's active because I can see the thing or the person, or in this case, the animal, that's doing the injuring. So it's foregrounded right at the beginning of the sentence. So there's the subject, there's the verb, material verb. There's a adverb. It's an adverb of manner, and there's the baby. There's the object. So we're going subject, verb, object. This is an active voice sentence. This, on the other hand, is a passive voice sentence. Baby is mauled by fox. Now, this fox that's been doing the mauling is kind of relegated to the back end of the sentence, and it's the baby that's the focus of it. And so, of course, we're going to feel absolute horror at the idea of this poor child being injured in this way. So this is the passive voice. So the object, what would usually be the object in the active form, has been put at the start of the sentence. We've got the verb to maul, which here is used, presented in the passive voice. So we've got a form of the verb to be, followed by the participle form of the verb, and then we've got the perpetrator of this crime, the fox, and that's been relegated to the back end of the sentence. So they mean the same thing, but the fact that one is active and one is passive puts a different tone and a different perspective onto the information. Okay, now that's pretty important. So the active voice of the verb will have a recognizable subject which performs the action of the verb. So the government issued a statement. There's the government. There's the verb. It's clear who was issuing the statement. Okay, now in contrast to that, you've got the passive voice. So the passive voice changes the object to the subject and places it at the beginning of the sentence. So here we've got a statement was issued by the government. So the government's still the subject, but now it's at the end of the sentence. And because it's at the end of the sentence, this can make it sound less important. You can kind of bury it away at the back end of the sentence. And indeed, the subject can be left out altogether. So if you do that, the emphasis is entirely on the action performed rather than who carried it out. So you might go, a statement was issued. And so the text receiver is not being invited to think about who actually issued the statement. As in that one there. Okay, so the uses of active and passive voices, once you get into this and you can identify them, is really interesting in public situations. There is a video clip here, which on the slideshow you'll need to have a look at because there's various uses being made there of the passive voice. Here's a little activity for you to do then. So change these sentences to the passive voice, and how has the effect of each sentence changed by doing so? So number 1, the Prime Minister forced the Home Secretary to resign. 2, the fire brigade fought the blaze all night. 3, John Jones attacked the young girl viciously, breaking 3 of her ribs. And 4, famine ravaged the country. So stop the video there and change those sentences to the passive voice. Okay, I'm assuming that you've done that. So number 1, the Prime Minister forced the Home Secretary to resign. So that's going to go into the Home Secretary was forced to resign by the Prime Minister. Yeah, it was Boris that did it. Okay. Number 2, the fire brigade fought the blaze all night. So the blaze was fought all night by the fire brigade. So it's putting the focus there on the fire, on the blaze itself, and less emphasis is being put on the fire brigade. John Jones attacked the young girl viciously, breaking 3 of her ribs. So the young girl was attacked viciously by John Jones, breaking 3 of her ribs. Again, the focus there is on the victim rather than the perpetrator of the crime. And then finally, famine ravaged the country. So the country was ravaged by famine. So generally, as a rule of thumb, using the passive voice does a couple of things. It sort of depersonalizes the action, okay, because it makes it less clear who's carried out an action. So it kind of depersonalizes things, and it also formalizes as well. So it lifts the level of formality. And whenever we're talking about formality on English Language A level, it's good to know about Joos. That's Joos, who is mentioned in the textbook and who came up with the idea that there are 5 different levels of formality. And these 5 different levels are frozen, formal, consultative, casual, and intimate. Okay, so I'm not going to spend time talking through all of those, but essentially, if the passive voice is being used in text, then that seems to make it feel more like either a consultative form or a formal form of register, or it even could be frozen as well. So it lifts the level of register. Okay, so here is something that I've copied off from the back of my passport, right? The gems that you're getting on this video. So what you need to do is analyze how the passport authority presents itself through its use of verbs. So you're spotting what's going on with the verbs, and then you're trying to link them in to meanings. Okay, so let's just talk about the first sentence, and then you're going to have a go at writing an analysis. So this passport remains the property of Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom and may be withdrawn at any time. So what verbs have we got? We've got the main verb here, remains. Okay, so this is a present simple verb. And the fact that the present simple verb has been used shows this is kind of timeless. Okay, it's unarguable and it's timeless and it's something that simply is. And later on, we have auxiliary verbs coming into play here. We've got a modal auxiliary. It may be withdrawn at any time. So we've got the use of a modal auxiliary verb there. Now, usually when we talk about modal verbs, we say, may, we would say, oh, well, that's probably quite epistemic. Like, I may go to the party. might not, I may go. But here, I may be withdrawn actually has kind of connotations of power, because the government can choose whether they're going to withdraw your passport or not. They have ultimate power on this. So note the quite subtle use of the modal auxiliary verb mode, may, here, in a kind of deontic way in this particular context. And so it's the use of the passive voice also that's important here. So we've got a deontic modal auxiliary verb, and we've got the passive voice being used as well. Okay, and this puts the focus on the passport then, and it takes away the focus from who is actually doing the withdrawing of this. Are these armed police that are going to be withdrawing your passport from you? We don't know, and you're not invited to even think about it. So the use of the passive voice here is depersonalizing the message, and it's also formalizing it as well, which is an important aspect, as I said before, about instrumental power. Instrumental power means that you've got hierarchical power over the text receiver. So I've managed to say quite a lot there, just about two verbs, remains and may be withdrawn. Your job is to go through the rest of these, identify the verbs. Are, for example, modal verbs being used? Is it active or passive? And then try and link it in with the meanings and the contexts. Okay, I'm going to leave this video hanging like that in the air.